Jake Sullivan, Biden's former national security advisor, currently a professor at the Harvard's Kennedy School, and as of next week, my near peer, a podcaster. Jake, welcome to ChinaTalk.
Well, thank you for having me. Now I have a whole different vantage point on being a guest on a podcast than before. So I'll spend my time silently judging you.
Yeah, no, we're going to teach you some lessons here.
Good,
This is a little master class.
Yeah.
You're going to call your new show The Long Game. How did what's your reflections on how crises interacted with, national power maximizing, or however you want to define the long game?
Well, part of the reason we're calling it the long game is I think it's incredibly important for us to lift our heads up and out of the smoke of immediate crises and say, how do we put the U.S. on the strongest strategic footing going forward? And that really is the ultimate essence of the long game. How do we marshal and husband the sources of American power in service of our national security, our prosperity, our values? So that's the ethos behind the long game. Now, to your question about the interaction between crises and the long game, it takes an enormous amount of discipline, especially, in my time in the seat when we were dealing with a lot of crises, a lot of different types of incoming, to say we're going to set aside the time, the effort, the resources, the top-level attention to actually focus on the long game. And I'm actually quite proud that through Ukraine and the Middle East and Afghanistan and Chinese balloons and lots of other stuff, we set aside the time to really invest in our alliances, invest in our industrial base, invest in a set of technology policies that I think advanced America's capabilities and help protect those capabilities from being used against us. So that requires discipline, a huge amount of discipline. And I tried to bring that discipline with me to work every day. I also was lucky to have a lot of people who were assigned to the long game things and not just the crises, who had no trouble banging on my door and saying, Jake, don't forget, we have to be working on this issue, whether it was chip controls or infrastructure projects in Africa or what have you. And having that kind of team around you, people who keep you honest and say, we're not going to let you just get swallowed by the inbox, that was very important as well.
Is there a design fix around this? Like, should there be two NSAs, the firefighter and the sort of long-term person? Like, why does this need to be one job?
I think it's a great question. And maybe it's right that if you think about the close advisors to the president, there shouldn't be any reason you couldn't have two people essentially dividing the job. I guess my overall reaction is that that's probably a process fix better done, with other senior people who are devoted to specific crises, not just someone who's like, I come in and handle all crises. And that a national security advisor should actually have the both dispensation and the instinct to say, I'm just not going to spend a lot of time on this particular set of issues. I'm going to have the principal deputy do that, or an envoy do that, or someone else in government do that, because I need to be allocating more of my time to the longer term things. That's probably a better way to do it than formally divide the role in two. But one thing I reflect on in my time in government is, should I have just more kind of consciously and systematically said, this is something I'm putting on someone else's plate, and I will check in on it every now and again, but it's not going to be something I'm responsible for.
What were the things that you decided you needed to own in order and drive personally very aggressively, and why did you make those calls?
Well, first, I felt I was unusual as a national security advisor in that I thought I had to be at the table as an advocate, a designer, and to a certain extent an implementer of domestic industrial policy, because I thought it was important that we have the national security perspective on that we be pushing that forward on chips, on clean energy, on infrastructure. So that was one thing that I put a lot of effort into, particularly in the first 2 years. Second, I thought the intersection of technology and national security was going to be defining, and so we created from whole cloth a new directorate on technology and national security. And I saw it as my responsibility to stay on top of that set of issues, Yes, semiconductor export controls, but also other areas, biotech, quantum, and as I mentioned before, the clean energy transition. And then third, I believed from the beginning that a defining feature of modern geopolitics is the competition between the U.S. and China. And I thought it was my responsibility to play a central role in the design and execution of our China strategy and in the management of the U.S.-China relationship. So those were areas that I felt, regardless of what else was going on anywhere else in the world, I had to be focused on. And tied to all of those, industrial policy, technology policy, U.S.-China, were allies. And that meant husbanding and stewarding our relationships with core allies, the G7 plus, India, Korea, Australia, in addition to the G7. And I put a lot of thought, energy, and effort into trying to elevate those relationships so that they were in the strongest possible state.
Just saying that, though, like, that sounds like an enormous amount of stuff.
Yes, and what didn't I mention in that? I didn't mention the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Or the multiple overlapping crises in the Middle East, or the drawdown from Afghanistan, or a lot else besides. Yeah, there's a lot going on. But, I mean, what I just named, those things, they're also interconnected. And they're not just four different piles of work.
Yeah.
They're, at our best moments, a coherent strategy that we were trying to drive.
So I guess maybe that's the follow-up then, is like, to what extent does one person, both being the push the long-term stuff and the, crisis manager, like, what are the upsides to having that all be on your shoulders?
Well, first of all, if you just take it from the top, the president of the United States has to do everything. Yeah, sure. There is no division of that job into multiple multiple different units. So at some point, as you go up any institution, any organization, you get to a CEO or a cabinet secretary or a president or a national security advisor. And so the question is, can you have a multi-headed monster at the top of the National Security Council enterprise? I think that's difficult because you're trying to execute and run a process that allocates time, energy, resources, priority, and then unity of vision and coherence of execution across everything. And I do think at the end of the day, you need a belly button for that. And that's why I think it has to be, basically in the job of the National Security Advisor. But I also believe that theories of delegation, of relative levels of personal engagement on different issues, have to be an important part about how someone in that role thinks about what they're doing day to day.
What do you think the pluses and minuses were of being the second youngest national security advisor when you started the job?
Well, it's interesting. I've thought a fair amount about this, and I think it may strike some of your listeners as surprising. I was 44 years old when I took the job. That's only a couple of years younger than Kissinger was when he took the job. I think he was 46.
45.
Okay. You've got it.
45 and a half. ChatGPT made us a chart. This
45
is
and a
not
half.
sponsored. Anyways.
And Brzezinski, 47, 48?
Brzezinski, 48. There's like a big cluster. McGeorge Bundy was 41, which is insane. And then Condi was 46. So you're not like an outlier on the young side.
I guess
but
the way
the mean is like 53 or something.
Right. But the way I look at this is there's a number of national security advisors around my age when I took the job. I felt very young in a way taking it because you think of the black and white photographs and the old, gray hairs and so forth. But that's a solid list of folks in their mid to late 40s entering this job with, in some cases, not a lot of government experience at all coming before them. In other cases, like Condi, quite a substantial amount of government experience coming before. Pluses of being on the younger side, energy, stamina, the capacity to really dig in and do the job full bore, full scale, 24/7. I believe that being willing to push the envelope and be creative and be dynamic and say, we're going to do things a different way. We're going to have a theory of the case and try to execute against it. That having kind of youthful vision and energy and creativity. And that's not just the person as national security advisor, it's also the team they build and the dynamic they build. And in my case, I felt I was able to build a very flat structure where everyone could come in, challenge, question, raise ideas, feel like they had a voice and there wasn't some oracle up top and a hierarchy. And I think that made for a much better, well, first of all, it was a better working environment, just more fun to work in that way. But I also think it allowed us to develop more interesting, more creative, more dynamic strategies in critical areas. Downsides, look, the biggest downside is having done this job for 4 years, I understand deeply, like to my bones, the value of experience, both positive experience and hard-won experience. And there's no substitute for it. But I would just say on this point, if you spend, let's say I spend another 10 years, not as national security advisor, but as something else, there's actually no substitute for experience as national security advisor. It is a truly unique type of seat to sit in that in some ways nothing can really actually prepare you for.
Well, more on that then. I don't know what did year 4 Jake Sullivan. What was year 4 Jake Sullivan able to do that year 1 wouldn't?
Well, actually, the most interesting part about experience is that to essentially metabolize experience, you need distance. So ask me in a year and I'll give you an answer to the question. I mean, okay. I'm being a bit glib, but what I mean is it's less that like in year 2, I was like, now I can do this that I couldn't do in year 1 and year 3. It's more the accumulation of that experience and then stepping away and then being able to say, okay, I now have lessons learned, things that worked well, things that didn't work well. As this conversation goes on, I'll point out some of those, I assume. I sometimes think that actually the right way for someone to do a job like this is to come in for 2 years, leave for 6 months, and then come back for 18 months or something like that, or in for 18, out for a year, back, I don't know, whatever it adds up to. Because I do think that leaving, even for a little while, just gives you an angle on what you were doing in the trenches that you just don't have when you're sitting in those trenches. So I think that's kind of an interesting model for how to think about this going forward, that you serve for a while, then you step away for a little while, then you come back and say, okay, now I've actually had the chance, as I said, to metabolize that experience. But anyway, that's an idle thought for others to consider down the road.
So on what dimensions do you feel like experience gets accrued?
Well, living through a crisis and actually having to stare square in the face the hard trade-offs and the imperfect choices, the lack of clear information, the need to form assumptions in the shadow of uncertainty. You can read all about that, but until you actually have to live through it, you're not, I think, going to fully understand what both the opportunities and limitations of that are. That's one. 2, converting vision into action. How do you actually turn the idea of an industrial strategy into results? Yeah, you kind of got to go through the thick and the thin of that and make progress, but also come up short to really be able to expose and understand, okay, what are the obstacles? What are the modes of operating? How could we have done things differently, faster, more ambitiously, more creatively? So those are a couple of examples of where I think having to actually do is what teaches you what works, what doesn't, and how to be most effective.
What about on the management side?
I mean, on the management side, it comes down to a combination of how do you get the best out of people? And here experience can cut both ways, to be honest with you, because, one thing that I observed over the course of my time in government is you get ground down, like your kindness, your patience, your sense of joie de vivre gets just ground down. And I think you become more impatient. Government is hard, so you become harder. And I had to constantly fight against that. So that's a asterisk proviso. Set that aside. That's how too much experience, too much time in the trenches can actually degrade you rather than enhance you. But how you actually get the most out of a team, how you run a process, what works and doesn't work with respect to trying to get to surface and crystallize options for the president, how to make the government as a whole all pull in the same direction. These are things that I think require trial and error. And it's a very human exercise. So any particular group of people is going to have its own psychology, its own sort of operating capacity. So you can take experience from one and it won't map neatly onto one administration, won't map neatly onto another, but there are some broader lessons that you can learn from it.
In 20th century American history, we have a bit of a pendulum between, on the one side, we maybe have like FDR and Trump of just like presidents kind of winging it. And then on the other side, the sort of reactions to that of like Truman being like, man, this FDR guy was crazy. We need to create an NSC.
Yeah.
Or the Biden administration. This Trump guy was crazy. We need to like bring in a Yale Law School person to like organize things. How do you see, after doing this job, the sort of trade-offs of both models?
Yeah, this is going to maybe be true to brand, but I actually think that the right answer is to try to land in the middle of the pendulum. And what I mean by that is I think rigorous, fair, honest process is really important to the long-term strength of the United States and to the discipline of strategy on the big picture. But I also believe that a president, a national security advisor, that they need a theory of what's really important and they need to get after it. So, I had kind of two people that I really looked at to try to approximate, not emulate, because, couldn't live up to these two guys, but approximate: Brent Scowcroft and Brzezinski. Scowcroft for process and for being an honest broker and for not coming in and just calling the shots, but rather teeing up the debates of principles to the president. Brzezinski, because he had a theory of geopolitics and a worldview that helped shape and drive decision-making, even as he dealt with a bunch of crises on the edges and margins of that. And I think a blend of those two strategies is the best way to pursue statecraft.
Are there dimensions on which you wish you would have had more freedom of maneuver? Or what felt the most constraining?
I think you've had Dan Wang on your podcast, right? So he wrote this book, Breakneck, which I thought was just incredibly thought-provoking, interesting. And his kind of overall thesis that America's run by lawyers, of which
you're the archetype, right?
Of which I am one, and China's run by engineers. There's a truth to that, and I would say democratic administrations are even more run by lawyers. Now, I don't think in the role of national security advisor, the kind of challenge of being a lawyer manifested the way other kind of elements of the government did, meaning it would have been great to have more freedom of maneuver to actually just build at speed and scale than we were able to accomplish, because we had every conceivable obstacle to being able to do that. That's true from the defense industrial base to infrastructure to building a semiconductor fab in Arizona.
Sure.
So that would be one area where more freedom of maneuver, more capacity to move fast would have helped. That's one. Two, the U.S. is funny. We're the richest country on the planet, deep in liquid capital markets, a massive federal budget, and yet our ability to mobilize capital in an intentional way to serve national security ends, both domestically and globally, is wanting. And so I would have loved more freedom of maneuver to be able to offer a value proposition to the countries of the global south for building infrastructure and competing with the Belt Road Initiative. And it was hard to even get nickels and dimes to be able to do that. And I think that was maddening, because for pennies on the dollar, I think we could have competed more effectively and can to this day compete more effectively, and we're not doing it because we can't get that money.
Okay, so what's the homework connected to that?
Well, so a couple things. One, and this is something that Larry Summers and I have had a running conversation about most recently at a conference up at Harvard, is we really need, I think, a deep and rigorous study of what are the objectives of industrial policy, what should be the limits of industrial policy, what are the tools that work and don't work, and then once it's being applied, what are the obstacles to actually executing in a way that delivers results on a reasonable time frame? And to the extent those obstacles need to be adjusted, how to adjust them. And that entire chain of questions, I would say people are looking at, some of my former colleagues like Todd Fisher and Mike Schmidt, who were central to the CHIPS Act effort, are really doing a deep study of some of this today. But there is not a body of work on this, in part because industrial policy was basically considered, unacceptable to stare at or work on. And I think we've got to bring it front and center, and not just with kind of the core economics profession, but that's got to be a dialogue between national security professionals and economists coming up with a range of answers to those questions that are rooted in empirics and evidence and rigorous study. And I would ask anyone out there who's thinking about, contributing to the national security literature of the future, this to me is a set of questions for which we need better answers than we have. And those answers will be in large measure defining of whether we're able to pursue an effective strategy.
So, CHIPS Act, kind of like a long game play.
Yeah.
But there is a world in which you do the October 7th controls, or you roll out the next batch December 2023, and China decides to play the rare earths card in the way that they did this year. I don't know. What you wake up the next day, like what do you do?
Well, first of all, we didn't wake up the next day and think about what to do, because we thought about that before we did the controls. We thought about retaliation risk. We thought about how to structure a strategy to protect our most advanced technology without getting on an escalation ladder that could end in harm to us, or a downward spiral, or, as we've just seen recently, the need for us basically to blink and back down. So we executed the controls in a way consistent with this theory of small yard, high fence, precisely to avoid the massive counter reaction that we have seen once President Trump decided to slap on 145% tariffs. And I think that was a credible and sensible strategy. Now, I also think it's totally fair to ask, and this gets to the point of hard-won experience. We knew that rare earths was a supply chain vulnerability for the United States. We knew that China was weaponizing it. We were explicit about that, open about that. We took steps on it. I could, send you a note with a whole list of things that all would look like perfectly credible steps one would take to try to reduce that supply chain vulnerability. And yet it obviously didn't end that vulnerability or even really truly dramatically reduce it. Why? And I've kind of really reflected on this question, and there's a few reasons. One is it is a new set of muscles for the government to intervene in markets where the markets have failed, or where a competitor like China has taken advantage of those markets basically to dominate supply. So we were trying to build that muscle. Second, it's a dynamic game. So, we made investments in U.S. firms. We also made investments in allies. And China was counter-reacting by cratering the price or, driving a particular processing plant out of business and so forth. And we hadn't yet kind of gotten fully up to speed in terms of that reaction, counter-reaction. And the thing that concerns me right now is I think the Trump administration is taking good steps on this, and they're obviously motivated, but it's still kind of linear from where we were, and we need to go really nonlinear. We need a much more, in my view, aggressive strategy. And so if I'd woken up the next day, to your question, after the imposition of the semiconductor export controls and they'd played the massive rare earth card, I would have said, drop everything. We need to solve this within the shortest possible span of time and essentially have Operation Warp Speed to get it done. And I still think that is what the Trump administration should do. I think they're moving in that direction, but I think now is the moment for more alacrity. And I say that as someone recognizing Trump 1, recognized this, not enough alacrity. Our administration, in the end, not enough alacrity. And I'm worried that that remains the case today.
Zooming back, we have two countries who are competing, who are deeply economically intertwined. Say you solve rare earths, say you solve APIs. It seems to me that insofar as the two countries have an enormous amount of sort of economic interaction with each other, there will still be ways for either country to sort of squeeze and cause the other one pain, even if it's not commercial. I mean, we saw Volt Typhoon, what the hell are you doing in water treatment plants, right? I'm sure you told them to knock it off and they didn't. It's a game worth playing, but what does is it a wrestling metaphor? It's if you're winning points in the round, but all of a sudden, someone could still pin you if they really felt like they needed to. How much does the incremental, resiliency-izing help the U.S. when it comes to these sorts of negotiations?
First of all, to your question about homework to your listeners, okay, let's fully map the vulnerabilities as far as we can see them. Let's ask where they are. Let's test this hypothesis you put forward that there is simply no end to interdependence and that there will be some fundamental vulnerability that can be exploited by China or, for that matter, by the United States. I think that is worth a deep dive, not just sort of all of us talking back and forth about it. I have three answers to this question. The first is there are different forms of vulnerability, meaning some act very fast and can be the pain can be applied asymmetrically, powerfully, and swiftly. Some act much more slowly and give you time to adjust, or they act in a way that harms the country imposing that action, so there's some degree of deterrence. So that's one answer, is let's just not have a list of all the interdependence, but we need to isolate the examples that are like rare earths. Sure. How many of those are there actually? Second, I would prefer to have fewer vulnerabilities rather than more.
Sure.
So if I can take some bullets out of your gun, could I still end up dead? Maybe. But if you gave me the choice between you having a full magazine and less than a full magazine, I would say let's make investments to do that. And then third, and I think this is really important, the more a country shows it has the muscle to be able to adapt and adjust if another country tries to weaponize interdependence, I think the more of a broader based deterrent effect it ends up having. So having the wherewithal to relatively rapidly identify and then close a gap, even if you know there are other gaps out there, I think has a knock-on effect on those other gaps too. So for all those reasons, I think we should still have a resilient strategy, though I do acknowledge that this is a very legitimate question. And part of the answer to it has to come down to a cost-benefit analysis of trying to deal with this resilience. In the rare earths case, the cost-benefit analysis seems to be pretty straightforward. This is not a massive market. It doesn't require us moving heaven and earth to resolve the vulnerability. It requires some determined concerted action, and we should take it.
The closest thing we got to a Sullivan doctrine was given September 2022, given the foundational nature of certain technologies, we must maintain as large of a lead as possible. There's the maximalist version of that where everything gets cut off. You're Stuxnetting, private companies, and there's the small yard, high fence version, of Biden vintage, where every day you put out, when you put out a new export controls, the next day we're recording an emergency podcast talking about all the loopholes. I'm curious for your reflections on what were the sort of, what was the calculus and what was constraining it? Was it domestic stuff? Was it political economy? Was it worries about retaliation? How did the level end up getting set?
One element's retaliation risk, and we kind of talked that through, right? If you just say to China, basically we're cutting you off altogether, then you're going to induce a really dramatic reaction. That's what happened when we fired a bazooka of 145% tariffs and they fired a bazooka back. So that is one element of it, for sure. A second element of it is trying to actually have some discipline about a threshold above which you actually have national security concerns and below which you're just talking about broad-based commercial or consumer applications, and wanting to have the American idea that we're not for just a total technology blockade. We are for focusing on those elements of technology that have genuine national security and strategic implications for us. A third aspect of it is what you said about kind of political economy, that you're trying to bring allies along. You're trying to bring your private sector along. You're trying to organize a government that has very different views on this. And so I think you said in your question, sort of reflect on this a bit. If you and I sat down for an hour and kind of went through 22, 23, 24, do I think we got all the calibrations right, all the levels? Of course not.
Sure.
I mean, first of all, in 22, they knocked out the interconnect and had the H99, and we had to, update the controls in part because that interconnect speed criteria didn't make sense. So we were learning as we went.
Sure.
The stockpiling of some of the manufacturing equipment, those timelines, we could walk through, but we were executing a novel strategy, trying to make sure that we were nurturing and sustaining our advantages, protecting our most advanced technologies, while at the same time dealing with this other set of considerations. I had breakfast with a guy I respect a huge amount in the technology field, who was basically like, my only objection to small yard high fence is that it should be big yard high fence. And I was like, and he had his argument was control legacy chips, control it all, I actually think the experience of this year and how things have played out compared with the experience of the last 3 years is good, is a good argument for small yard high fence, for a particular style and strategy of a pretty aggressive policy that is conducted with a degree of care and precision, because I think that was a more sustainable policy for the United States over the longer term than just going, letting her rip. Now, it's hard to say for sure that that's right. There's no algorithm for this. But that was the judgment that we reached, and that's why we proceeded the way that we did. The last thing I would raise on this is, having watched President Trump do what he has done with our allies, was the right answer just FTPR, the foreign direct product rule from the start? Basically, don't negotiate with our allies over coordinated semiconductor manufacturing equipment controls. Just tell them they got American content. You're not selling them. Done. I think about that sometimes. That comes down to a question really of what are the longer term costs of treating your friends that way. And I believe that there are genuine longer term costs for that are real and strategic and meaningful, but I can't prove that. That's something we're going to have to watch over time because now we're running a real lab experiment.
Yeah. All right, let's do some China stuff. So you've seen
Am I boring you?
No. Oh no. This is part of the game. It's like this is not obvious where to go next.
Okay.
Like there's
All right.
10 different
Cool.
questions.
Cool.
I could ask you about, you said, okay, well, with breaking the fourth wall on the podcasting stuff, you said like there's not an algorithm. I could pick on that and be like, all right, how would you use AI in your job today if you had? Right. There's more industrial policy questions. I could do another question on the tech control. Okay, big fence, FDPR. Like, do you think China would have freaked out? Should we have had Huawei's still a thing? Like, you probably could have made it not a company or come close. If you really wanted to, it could have been smaller than it is today.
I guess here's what I would say about some of these arguments. Like, if only you do this extra thing on Huawei, then that happens. It reminds me of the real socialism has never been tried argument.
Look,
it's possible. You're right. But just one more crushing sanction or export control.
Well,
you're right.
The chart of.
By the way, I'm being glib because you may be right. I'm just saying there is a certain. You may be right, but I think the question that one has to grapple with is some of the assumptions that underpinned the Huawei controls that were put in place in the Trump administration and the statements about what would happen as a result of those controls, not the next better version later down the line, didn't quite bear out. And, we have to grapple with that too. You may be right that just taking more steps in the Biden administration could have made all the difference.
I mean, I think you identified the biggest what if is FTPR on equipment earlier because the big chart is the one where SME exports double and double again and double again. Yeah. And it's like you're trying to control it, but it's not happening. Yeah. And then we had this BIS 50% rule and now it's not here anymore. So it's going to keep doubling, right? Yeah. So that seems to me to be the big fork in the road.
I think it's a big question and I'm not sure what the right answer is. We had a thesis with respect to our allies. You work with them rather than coerce them. That obviously meant China got access to more manufacturing equipment than if we had just coerced them. But in a net assessment of the overall health, vitality, strength of those relationships and how they would play out in, to coin a phrase, the long game, I think that's a big question. And again, President Trump is testing that question because he's basically saying, I don't buy it. I can go punish all these people as much as I like, and they're just going to have to keep being friends because they have no other choice. And he seems to think that'll just be how it is. I happen to think what's more likely is you get a group of countries that were coming along with us to de-risk from China, who now are sitting there thinking, I got to do what I got to do today, but over time, I need to de-risk from the United States. And I don't think that in the end that is going to be a winning strategy. So these are the kinds of calls that you have to make in the shadow of uncertainty. I will say we didn't have knockdown dragouts about FDPR. I think there was a general sense that we should try to negotiate this with our allies rather than just club them over the head. And, there are also other ways to get at this challenge than FDPR, like timelines on implementation and how companies went about allowing the stockpiling despite government agreements and so forth. So that's for another time, maybe over a drink.
You've seen the arc, man. You were present at the creation of the Xi era. What I don't know. What do you believe about him that's not consensus?
Oh, what do I believe about him that's not consensus? That's interesting. I think he is more improvisational than the kind of theory that he's just set out a coherent strategy that they are just going to execute. And he's like basically any other leader of any other big unruly country, and that he's got to make a lot of stuff up as he goes along.
Accidental conflict. It's something Americans worry about. I personally am skeptical that like if two countries really don't want to fight, they can trip into a war neither side really wants. Am I wrong here? Is this something I should be more scared of?
I think it's such a fair question. It's almost like a shibboleth of like the risk of mistake, miscalculation, escalation, the ships bumping into each other in the South China Sea, and all of a sudden you're in World War III. I share a degree of your skepticism. I think that there are restraining factors that can allow disengagement and de-escalation. But let me give you a hypothetical scenario, and you tell me if it worries you or you're like, they'd work it out. It's just fine. So as you know, the PRC is pressing closer and closer to the island of Taiwan in the air and on the sea, bumping up against, fewer and fewer nautical miles offshore, right? And they're doing that with manned aircraft. They're doing it with ships. They're doing it with drones. At some point, let's just say Taiwan says, we can't tolerate this anymore. We got to go like fire a warning shot, or we got to go, do a fake dogfight with one of these planes to show them that we're not tolerating the continued encroachment. And then one thing leads to another, and those two planes splash down. You think next day it's cool?
I mean,
does that bother you? Does that worry you? Because that scenario do I think automatically we're off to the races? No, but that kind of scenario in an already unstable environment, operational environment, I don't know, that the risk of a tactical mistake leading to a change in the strategic situation, I'm not like at one end of the spectrum on this that you're pushing against, but I'm not quite where you are, I don't think.
Yeah. I mean, it wouldn't be a nice thing. You'd lose some sleep over it.
Yeah, and that's kind of, the thought experiment to me is that, like, why would you lose sleep over? Because you'd be like, well, there is a possibility now. Maybe not that immediately the invasion force comes flowing over the horizon, but rather that it leads to a change in the national conversation on the mainland. It leads to arguments that we just can't tolerate this. There has to be punishment. And so on. And yes, can that contribute to a shift in a negative direction that raises the risk of outright conflict? I think it can. I don't want to overstate the case because I take your point, but that kind of scenario worries me more in a way than the U.S. and China bumping up against each other. India-Pakistan's another example where I think mistake can lead to very rapid escalation. So to me, it's a little bit more condition specific than just sort of in the abstract.
But isn't the lesson of the most recent India-Pakistan almost the other thing? It's like, okay, we have a game now, and we just play it every 5 years.
Yeah, actually,
it probably doesn't feel like that if you're getting woken up at 4 o'clock in the morning.
You know what? I'll take that point. I think that's fair because I basically agree with you that at the end of the day, the two sides don't want to go to all-out war, and so there's reasons for them to end up not doing so. So I withdraw the India-Pakistan example.
Was it a mistake for Pelosi to go to China?
To China?
Yeah. Jesus.
I'm going to, look, I want to be fair to the Speaker Emerita, give her her airtime.
She's declined her invitation, for the record. But
I went up and, no, I'm saying I'm going to give her airtime right now.
Okay, great.
So because I'm going to answer your question, but I don't, I want to do it in a fair way. I spoke with her about going to Taipei, and she basically said to me, all you White House is Democrat, Republican, like you're all too restrained. I should be able to do what I want to do. And nobody should tell us whether we can go to a city and so forth. So she was pretty clear and direct in her view. I believe that the cost to Taiwan of that visit far exceeded the benefit to Taiwan of that visit. So for me, it's pretty simple calculus.
How so?
Well, I think it led to not just an immediate reaction by China that put a huge amount of pressure on Taiwan, but it led to a change in the operational environment around Taiwan that has not gone back to the way it was before. So substantive changes in Taiwan's immediate environment to the negative. On the positive side, kind of what? Some symbolism, I guess, but
Reporting that chip controls only happen because of this.
well, that's crazy.
Okay. All right. On the accidental risk stuff, speaking of you getting stressed out, Putin nuclear scenario is probably like I assume is the scariest thing you had a 5-10% chance of seeing. I don't know. Like you've already given some reflections on this, but maybe from we had all these NSC management questions. Like, okay, this is you know, it wasn't your first year, but this is the big one. I don't know what sticks with you. About
so, this is fall of 22. The Ukrainians are on this counteroffensive in Kherson and Kharkiv. And the intelligence community at the most senior levels comes to the president and says, if there's a catastrophic collapse of Russian lines and Putin feels that he's in danger of potentially losing the war, there's a 50% chance, a coin toss, that he will use tactical nuclear weapons to avert that defeat and shore up his lines. Okay. So, and by the way, this is not just people guessing out of thin air. This is people who have studied this issue or watching everything going on, who have amassed a fairly broad-based view across the intelligence community of this judgment. So you're the president of the United States, you're the national security advisor, you're the secretary of defense, and you're like, all right, we got to deal with that. Can't be paralyzed by it. You got to keep supporting Ukraine, but we got to deal with that. So we gathered in the Situation Room. We ran tabletop exercises. What would happen? What would we do in response? What would they do in response to our response? I would say not very pleasant scenarios, all told. And so we communicated directly with the Russians about the consequences of taking such an action. And of course, we reached out to, among others, China to get them to weigh in as well. But this is the kind of thing where the difference between a commentator sort of saying, I don't think it's a very serious risk, and actually being in the seat, having the responsibility to the American people of taking very seriously what sober senior intelligence professionals are telling you, while also continuing to support Ukraine. That was very real and very challenging. And I do not believe that this was all just BS. I think this was a risk. If it had happened, the first nuclear use since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the United States would have had to take meaningful action in response, and that action could easily have led to a totally different form of escalation between us and Russia. So it's good it did not happen. I think a lot of people look at the fact that it didn't happen and say this was all what it was. I think I think we had some influence over it, and events on the battlefield had some influence over it as well.
So, we've talked about a few different escalatory ladders. We have the sort of like econ tech fights. Yep. We have like some planes hit each other in the sky. But this is like, it's sort of different than what they were theorizing in the 50s and 60s. But I don't know. Do you have a comment? What's my question?
Well, I think your question is, how the hell do you deal with that? Yeah. No, I mean,
it's like you can. Well, maybe it's like you can mess up a little bit with the rare earth stuffs and the trip controls, and like it's manageable, right? But maybe.
Well, look, it raises a question about risk tolerance, right? So, you're walking on a narrow mountain path and there's a steep cliff off to, one side's the mountain, the other side's a steep cliff. The path is, call it 5 feet wide. Okay. Like, do you walk right on the edge, say, I don't think I'll slip, or do you walk up against the mountain? And I feel like a lot of the debates over the nuclear escalation thing is, why weren't you closer to the edge? Why were you closer to the mountain? And I think the right answer on this is you have to keep moving forward. You got to go from point A to point B. You can't stop providing weapons to Ukraine, intelligence to Ukraine, capacity to Ukraine. But you also have a responsibility to the American people not to fall off the cliff.
Can you talk about sort of psychologically, sort of yourself and your team? I mean, again, it's one thing to like be in the CIA for 30 years and be thinking about Russian nuclear posture. And it's another thing when it's like the week when it's more risky than any time since the 80s or even the 60s. And, the same for you.
One thing that I'm like playing around with in my head, I don't want to say it wrong because it's going to sound somehow like I didn't take my job seriously enough and I took my job effing deadly seriously, is that I think somehow stress and stakes and consequences normalize. What I mean by that is like the human capacity to just adjust to your circumstance. So I was an associate at a law firm in Minneapolis working on commercial litigation. And we had these cases that kept me up at night. Okay. And I stressed out over, did we get this right or get that wrong? And I second guessed and recriminated in the whole thing. Okay. Then I end up in this nuclear scenario. It's, these are night and day, but somehow human beings don't just have like an infinite level of calibrating stress. They just have their bands and then they're presented with things. And some of them are life or death situations and some of them are life or death decision-making situations. And so you get up in the morning and you go to work and you do your job and then you go home at night and you execute your responsibility to the best of your ability to do so. I don't have a better answer than that, but I don't feel like, I was some special person. I was just a guy who had a job and this was the problem presented in that job and I had to deal with it. But a lot of it is just about being able to inhabit that mindset and say, I got to go to work. This is my job today. But that didn't mean I didn't sweat through a lot of shirts.
It's a good point. It's like, look, the Marines fought on Peleliu and Iwo Jima.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, you're going to an office.
Yeah, exactly. This is such a good way of putting it. Somebody is walking into the teeth of gunfire at Omaha Beach, who a year before was a school teacher in my hometown of Minneapolis.
School teacher was a high schooler,
Yeah, it was a high schooler. Yeah, exactly. So the ability to normalize just to your situation, like, this is my job today. Right. Exactly. And that's so much more real than anything I had to deal with. Yeah. And yet, like, we all have really stressful and complicated situations in our lives. And so even when something is objectively not that high stakes, I don't begrudge people that they feel super stressed in that situation, because they're just operating within the range we all operate of stress and stakes based on their lived experience.
But there have been very few humans in like human history who have like stared down a nuclear war and like managed through it. So even then, it still is kind of a unique experience.
Yeah, it's a lot. I mean, it is a lot. It's heavy. And, the other important thing is, we're all just human beings, like, leading 3-dimensional lives. While dealing with all of this, dealing with family stuff or health stuff or whatever the case may be. And so, I talked about before about how you can get ground down in these jobs and kind of lose a certain sense of who you are. There is a way in which the stress and the stakes harden you, that you don't even quite realize at the time. And being vigilant for that, to try to remember at the end of the day that it's your job to be a good and decent person, is a really important thing. And that requires more discipline than I think often in a given day you can bring to bear.
You said on a podcast you still don't sleep well. Like, did you sleep well before?
I feel like in Trump 1, there was a period where I had a really hard time sleeping post 2016. But yeah, I would say I slept pretty good. And I don't now, because in many ways, a lot of the things that we dealt with had no perfect outcomes achievable. And so the outcome was going to be painful in one way or another. And there were some painful outcomes. And then they happen, and you're like, well, what if I'd done this? Or what if I'd done that? Or what if we had done this? And what could we learn from that? And you turn it over in your head. And then you do all of that with perfect hindsight, which is a super problematic thing to do, because you could only make those decisions in the moment. But I don't know. I think that's just going to be what it is for me for a while, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think, in a way, it's the completion of discharging your responsibility in a job like I had is not to walk out the day you're done and just go, all right, someone else's problem. It's to continue to wrestle with it kind of indefinitely. That's part of the service, I think.
As our first gift, I know we're past the $50 limit. Amazon sent a kind of comically large bag of chamomile flowers. So, just to help you out with that a little bit.
I love it. That's so kind. Does this work?
It's just chamomile tea. So
yeah, so it doesn't work.
As that does,
so it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. But I
can't like prescribe you drugs here. Like,
maybe not on the podcast.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I do want to ask you you mentioned earlier, like, you think the thinking around AI is AI national policy is really poor. Like, what are the sort of most hottest questions you wish there was better thought on?
Let me be absolutely clear. If I may have said that, if I did, I don't mean to say it's really poor. I mean to
early innings.
Because I think they're brilliant people thinking about this, and they're thinking thoughts way beyond in complexity and sophistication that I could think. My concern is that we are designing strategy, and who's the we? Because it's a combination of this government plus these big private companies that are driving the frontier, without really kind of fully unearthing the assumptions underlying those strategies. So a world in which we are rapidly approaching AGI and ASI versus a world in which it's a kind of bounded and jagged pathway towards greater capability. What you would do across a range of different inputs is different in those two worlds. And yet, I don't think we sit and kind of work out, what is our relative confidence in one world as opposed to the other? What are the can't fail or the must do's, no regrets? And then what are things we have to be able to adjust as we gain more information? That's just one example of many of where I think getting technologists and strategists together to really go through the underlying assumptions of where all this is going is important. And I think most of this conversation floats above at a plane of abstraction. And as a result, we pursue a policy with a lot of hidden assumptions that we haven't fully validated or unearthed. So that's my main concern. And something I'm kind of turning over in my head and thinking about how to articulate better than I just did.
Maybe more broadly, like the process of gathering information, even though it's under, uncertainty and you'll never get to, much less 80% confidence with some of these things. Like, how did you think about it and the sources, and how did that sort of evolve over time for you?
Well, first of all, when you're in government, access to information is amazing. My friend Kurt Campbell likes to say, when you're in government, the shit comes to you. When you're out of government, you have to go find the shit. Okay. And I think there's a kind of simple, crude elegance to that. First of all, we could have senior people from the AI labs come in and actually present to us where they were in their capabilities and where they were going and what concerned them, like literally in the flesh, just do it. We could also get all of the, industry data and analysis synthesized by a team of people at Name Your Agency in the U.S. government and supplied to you as well. So I would say that the biggest weakness on the U.S. government side in terms of the consumption of information is that we tend to over-prioritize classified information over unclassified information because we somehow think it's more special. And particularly in technology, it's the unclassified information where you really find out what the hell is going on. But basically, all you can do is try to bring in as much as you can. And then I believe in the debate method, basically, of having people on opposite sides or at different ends of the spectrum on a given question of what's likely to happen, actually kind of debate it out, unearth it, and figure out where they agree and where they disagree and isolate the points of disagreement. Because I think that method gives you the best confidence that you've actually kicked the tires on all the potential perspectives. And then you just have to decide where you land, where you fall.
Trump, too, does not seem to see China as the threat that you guys, and Trump 1 seemed to characterize it as. Two questions fall out of that. Like, to what extent do you think if he really tries, he can change the tenor of this relationship? How structural is the competition, basically? And, given that this is what they're seeing, is there... if you had foresight into this, is there any, would the bias have been to push harder or push less hard?
Oh, second's a good question. And I think increasingly it's going to be a salient question because I think we are going to see more swings in U.S. foreign policy in the years ahead. So future national security advisors will have to contemplate dramatic departures one way or the other. And we're kind of seeing that play out, the lessons of that right now. On the first question, here's what I think. I think it's structural. I think the United States and China are two big, ambitious, dynamic countries with proud people who want to succeed and, frankly, don't want someone else calling the shots or having undue influence or having greater capacity than they have. And we have two different political systems, two different value systems, and therefore I think competition is a feature of the relationship. What I don't think is structural is that it has to be conflict. Where I think we have the ability to influence things is to manage that competition effectively. But I think the idea that you can just wish the competition away and go with win-win peaceful coexistence and all these kinds of phrases, I don't really buy that. And frankly, I don't think China buys that deep down. So I think President Trump can talk about the G2. And I completely agree. He looks at this through an economic lens, a mercantilist lens, and not a lens of strategic competition. But at the end of the day, I think these structural factors will shine through. I have to think about whether it would have made us do something different. That's a bit of a mind bender, projecting back and then forward. But it's a totally reasonable question.
So, you talked earlier about like the personal weight of all this. And you said somewhere that you almost envy the people who can have more confidence in their calls. The irony, of course, is this new book about McNamara at war. And, he's the one who projected the most confidence out of any of these folks. And he had panic attacks. And, it was actually all a cover for all his sort of insecurity. So
I was being a little wry when I said that.
Okay.
Insofar as kind of that's like understated Minnesota, I don't know, wryness. Kind of what I meant was I just find it so interesting that people can assert things like yes, it's this, and you're like, well, congratulations. Like, I'm so glad that you just know that. I will tell you, going back to the point about hard-won experience, is most of these issues do not have easy calls, and they have trade-offs, and they have puts and takes. And so I really admire the self-confidence because I could sleep at night super easily then, and it's just like a hell of a lot less pain and suffering. But I don't think it's right.
All right. Well, we got 3 more midnight reading books for you.
Cool.
Sign off one. I think this is best suited for midnight. Feeding Ghosts. It's actually a graphic memoir.
Wow.
It just won the Pulitzer.
Damn.
It's a sort of personal history with the U.S.-China arc in it that
I can't wait.
It's really fun. The social history of the machine gun. It is one of the most it is probably the most stylishly written sort of military history I've ever come across. And it sort of goes through the technology, the companies, the sort of acquisition side, and then the like human and strategic implications.
Fantastic.
And someone's going to have to write the social history of the drone. We didn't get to drones today. We'll have you back, maybe. But that book's a real treat. Last one, to run the world. This is already on the list.
It's on the list. I don't have it though, so I'm glad you gave it to me. But I'm excited to read this book.
Okay. The sort of the bit that calls back so much right now was Brezhnev getting really stressed that Nixon went to China, and then they have this meeting, and he's like, "We can be a G2. Us together can rule the world." And Nixon's like, "Maybe I'll think about it. TBD." Final thing. Feedback for ChinaTalk. What do you want to put on my plate, or our team's plate, actually?
I think this, bringing on some more people on future of manufacturing, supply chains, industrial strategy, all the things that we were talking about a little bit ago that I think deserve so much more depth, like getting folks in to really unpack a lot of the kinds of questions Dan was posing, that Larry and I have been grappling with, that Chris Miller has been thinking a lot about. I know you do this, but doing a dedicated series on this subject with this, a specific emphasis on the particular challenge China poses and what the United States should be using government tools for to deal with it and what we should not be, so that we don't try to out China. Yeah, that'd be a piece of advice I would give.
Cool. All right. Well, we'll see how well Jake, who's going to the Knicks Timberwolves game, fares at security with a giant bag of chamomile tea
and several books.
Several books. Cuts off. Thank you so much.
Thank you.